help move your teams along. So I'm going to hit record because we always like to record and share these out with folks who maybe registered but couldn't join us. And so we are going to dive in. I want to take a second to orient us to some of the accessibility features of Zoom. So throughout the presentation, we're going to have several opportunities, again, to chime in through the chat. And you should also have the option to see closed captioning or live transcript if that's a feature that would be helpful for you today. My name's Krista Reed. I'm a program director here at the Ability Challenge, and I am joined by my colleague Rachel.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel. I am also a program director with the Ability Challenge. And just a little bit more about the Ability Challenge if you're unfamiliar. We are an organization that partners with schools, districts, and networks to help leaders and teachers build authentically inclusive school communities that meet the needs of all students. So we have a special focus on students with disabilities, but the work that we do is grounded in the Thrive framework, which is our evidence-based roadmap for the knowledge, mindsets, and practices required of leaders and educators to create the optimal conditions for diverse learners.
This is our third conversation about behavior. We started this fall series to talk about a topic that we knew folks were interested in discussing. We know when we talk about diverse learners, our classrooms are more diverse than ever, and folks are seeing a lot of an uptick in behavior. And so today's session is sort of a final part of a three-part series. We're going to talk about three common leadership pitfalls when it comes to these conversations around behavior that we see pop up pretty often. We're going to really dive into the connection between adult stress and these patterns and explore some concrete strategies that help support both staff well-being and some of the staff components of this and effective practice. That's really going to help move the needle for kids and for students. So we want to help you understand how those things connect. And here's the thing, right? These pitfalls that we're going to discuss aren't just technical mistakes, right? They're rooted in really emotional and emotionally challenging parts of dealing with challenging student behavior, right? It takes a toll on our team. And so we want to talk about those connections. So we're going to dive into that as we move along today. So, here, if you've joined us in the other two sessions before this, these may feel like very familiar ideas. Some of the big ideas that we've covered previously are that, first of all, behavior is communication, right? We think of behavior as kind of an iceberg, that what we're seeing in behavior is often the tip, but underneath the surface, under the water, there's something that we need to be paying attention to. And when we align our interventions and responses to what the student is communicating, to the actual function of the student's behavior, we're going to be more effective than just giving general consequences or using a one size fits all approach to behavior. And so what we see is that effective teams really take that to heart and approach behavior in a problem-solving way, kind of the way that we do with academics, right? When a student has a reading problem, we get to the root of it. We figure out, well, is it a phonemic awareness or a phonics or an orthographic mapping problem? Is it a problem with comprehension or listening comprehension, right? We dig in and we understand more of the why behind what's going on in that gap for that student. And critically, the final one, right? All students can grow and develop new skills, which means every student's capable of finding more effective ways to communicate and get their needs met, which means we can design more effective behavior support. And it's not about fixing a quote unquote bad kid. It's not about punishing our way out of a behavior cycle. It's about teaching that student missing skills and proactively designing environments where that student can experience success. If you've attended any of our earlier sessions, or if, behavior is just kind of your jam, if there's anything else you would add to this list of kind of foundational ideas for behavior, feel free to drop those in a chat for us, right? This is not an exhaustive list of all of the things, all of the beliefs about behavior that really guide even our approach. So I'll pause here, and if there's anything you'd add, feel free to drop those in the chat. I'm going to move us along and keep checking the chat. If there's anything we want to come back to, we always can. What we're going to talk about today, and we talked about this at the top of the call, is that leadership is a linchpin in effective behavior support, right? Leaders set the tone for how teams think about and respond to student behavior. The questions that leaders ask, the frameworks that we use, the mindsets that we develop, and how we facilitate that collaborative problem solving all directly shape the experience, not only that our staff have, but then the support that our students receive. Leaders set the tone for how staff feel, right? Supported or alone, capable or overwhelmed. And we know that behavior management and challenging behavior is consistently cited as a top stressor for our teachers. It is one of the number one reasons for teacher burnout, and for teachers when they leave the field, they say it's because of behavior. So these things are really important to understand that connection.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that one of the things that is really important to stamp is when your team is able to understand behavior and respond effectively to it, that actually helps reduce teachers' stress more. So when teachers feel supported emotionally, also, they have the capacity to engage in better practices. So throughout today, we'll be addressing both dimensions, but we'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to use the chat to tell us what you're seeing, what are some of the biggest challenges schools are facing when it comes to behavior? Um, and like leaders, what's your biggest challenge in kind of supporting your teachers or your schools with behavior? So feel free to use the chat. All right, Jackie said lack of parental support.
If you're a teacher, if you're not an administrator, right? What is one thing that you wish that others better understood about your experience with challenging behavior? When I talk to teachers, I feel like one of the things that I hear a lot is feeling like I'm doing a lot, right? We're all working really hard. Sometimes we've got like a 10-page plan of what to do for a student, and it still feels like nothing is working. Um, and when I hear from leaders, I hear this just takes a lot of time. And so, um, Rachel, I don't know if there's anything you would add that you hear when you hear from voices in the field.
Yeah, I think from the leader perspective, a lot of leaders understand that it takes a lot of time and sometimes a lot of capacity to get right. But also the payoff on the other side is worth it. But in the moment, it can still feel very much like a daily struggle. Um, so, like capacity, I would say, is a common issue.
Yeah. Well, here's our agenda for the day, right? We're gonna role play a few scenarios that highlight some of these common pitfalls. We'll close out and summarize, and then we'll leave a little time for Q&A and some closing. So we're going to dive into our first pitfall. Rachel and I are going to role play a pretty typical conversation between a teacher and a school leader about a student's challenging behavior. And as we do this, we would like you to listen and think about what is missing from our conversation. Hi, Rachel. Thanks for meeting with me today about Aiden. I know his behaviors have been challenging, so walk me through what's happening.
Oh my gosh, Aiden, he's constantly blurting out. He makes jokes. He does anything that he can to get the class to look at him. It's just attention seeking and it's getting distracting.
Yeah, that sounds pretty classic attention seeking. How often is this happening?
Literally multiple times a day. It happens during math, it happens during writing. He just wants everyone's eyes on him.
Oh, okay. Well, what have you tried so far?
Tried ignoring him, ignoring his behavior, only giving him attention when he's doing the right things, but honestly, it's just not working. And if anything, he's getting worse.
Have you sent him to the office?
Yeah, probably like 5 or 6 times in the last 3 weeks. He actually calms down once he gets there. The secretary usually sits with him and he'll do his work with her outside the office.
That's interesting. You said it's mostly during math and writing?
Yeah, those are our longest blocks, so more opportunities for his attention seeking, I guess.
Yeah. Does it happen during science or social studies?
Now that you mention it, not really, but those are more hands-on and group work, so I think he likes to be able to kind of work with his peers then, and then he can get his attention that way. But during independent work time, it's really when he acts up.
And you said he does complete some work in the office when the secretary sits with him?
Yeah, he does do some of his work when they're together.
Mm. I wonder if it's because he's getting that one-on-one attention from the secretary, because that would make sense to me. So, what do you think we should do moving forward?
I don't know. I just want to stop giving in to his attention-seeking behavior because it's really distracting the class.
Yeah. I feel like maybe if we give him a point sheet and we give him more structured consequence systems and give him that like feedback loop, that'll probably help. So let's communicate that plan to the family, right? Make sure they understand what this point sheet is and why it's coming home. And I think if we're more consistent with our consequences when he's being disruptive, we can also make sure everyone's on the same page about withholding that attention, like even when he gets sent to the office, because we don't want to be, reinforcing that behavior.
Okay, fair enough. I think we can try that.
All right, thanks.
Okay, so on the surface, this seems like a pretty typical conversation. The teacher has identified what she thinks is happening. Aiden has attention-seeking behavior, and the principal is asking probing questions about what she's noticing. So eventually, they agree to move forward with a point sheet that will align to what they think the function is, which they believe is attention-seeking.
Yep. So we've got a hypothesis, right? Aiden's classic attention seeking behavior. The administrator agrees that the data point's there. We've talked about what you've tried, right? We've tried ignoring the negative behaviors and only giving him attention when he's doing the right thing. We've got some data that suggests like he can do the work. And so we assume that that one-on-one attention is what he's seeking. So we create this plan. We're going to withhold attention. We're going to do more consistent consequences and a point sheet, kind of like a behavior contract. But let's look at what's missing, right? What's missing from this conversation is some acknowledgement of some contradictory information or some additional information, right? In our conversation, the teacher said planned ignoring has increased the behavior and not decreased it, right? Our working hypothesis is that it's attention. So if we withhold it, it should get better, but it's not. The behavior is only happening during math and writing, it's not during all activities. And so like so that kind of undermines our hypothesis there, right? And being removed from class is resulting in task completion, which is counterintuitive if our hypothesis is attention seeking. So what the data is actually telling us is that there might be a different function of the behavior. It might be escape from difficult written tasks. But instead of addressing that function and those academic skill deficits, the plan is to punish him more consistently for disruption, which, like planned ignoring, will probably just make things worse because those responses aren't actually aligned to the function of Aiden's behavior. So, what's happening here is a classic case of what we call confirmatory bias. The leader in this scenario is asking questions, they're doing the probing, but ultimately, we end up running with our initial hypothesis without considering any alternative sort of theories of what's going on. So we didn't collect any new information. We didn't review any data that would help us sort of check ourselves before we wrecked ourselves and created like a more formal point sheet that's based on a flawed hypothesis or a potentially flawed hypothesis.
Right. So it's not intentional, but it can really lead us astray when us as leaders don't operate from the data. And so sometimes, even when we do have the data, we sometimes don't use it or we ignore it, or we weigh some data more heavily than others, or only pay attention to data that confirms the original hypothesis. So all of these are examples. All of these are examples of confirmatory bias, and that's one of the pitfalls we definitely want to get away from.
Yeah. Like in that scenario with Aiden, right? We knew that sitting with the secretary was helping him complete work. And instead of pausing and really digging into that for a second, we made it fit our hypothesis. We said, oh, he's sitting with her, so he's getting that one-on-one attention, rather than saying, well, what does sitting with her and him completing his work actually indicate to us? What could there be another way of looking at this? Are we trying to solve the wrong problem here? Because we have the wrong sort of theory about why the student's behaving the way that they are. And so that pause and being like, wait a minute, what could that tell us? Would have been really helpful in the situation with Aiden. So Rachel, talk to us a little bit about like what happens when we engage in this in a sort of unchecked way.
Yeah, so what we see as a result of this is that teams don't explore alternative functions and then they use interventions that don't address the real root cause of the behavior, and then that doesn't really stand a chance at being effective.
Yeah. And I'd add those interventions might actually make behavior worse, that's exactly what the teacher said here, right? Everyone's frustration starts to increase. We're doing everything right according to our plan, but nothing's actually improving. And this becomes this demoralizing cycle for everyone, right? The teacher's getting frustrated because I'm doing everything that we said we would do. The family feels like, well, you guys have this plan. I can't see what's happening during the day. Like, are you following it, or is the plan just not the right one? And then the student doesn't feel better, right? I wouldn't feel great if I was a kid with a point sheet and I was doing everything I could to try to get my points, but behavior wasn't like, improving, and my teachers were getting more frustrated with me. So no one is feeling good when we're stuck in this cycle because of confirmatory bias. So we know this doesn't feel good. It doesn't produce results. Why is this so common? Why do we do this so often, right? I mean, first of all, this is just a human thinking trap, right? To take data and make it fit our original thinking. We know that happens outside of education all of the time. We, if you're a leader and you've seen this before, definitely put it in the chat why you think this happens. But um, I think for me, what I see most often is that folks want to help quickly, right? It's that element of time that we talked about before. We want to get to a solution and we want to show teachers that we trust them. So we might ask questions to probe a little bit, but if we ask something that sounds like doubt or distrust about what they're experiencing, that doesn't feel great. We want to make a quick decision and we want to sound like we trust teachers, and we do trust teachers, and data is very powerful and can tell us things. So, because pausing and saying, let's gather more data first before we make a plan isn't very satisfying, we often see folks just kind of running on their previous assumptions or their previous hypothesis. So, what should you do instead? Number one, I think we need to normalize data collection as part of that initial step more often. I think it's very common when students are getting a very involved, maybe FBA and BIP that's being created by a specialist. It's not often an initial step for a lower level, maybe tier two or a teacher guided intervention. At my school, we just simply didn't put interventions in place until we did some data gathering, even with something like a behavior contract or a check in, check out. We would collect some baseline data with that check in, check out. We'd run like sort of a ghost week where we'd run the check in, check out and gather some of that baseline data to number one, like check that our goals are set correctly. And even that just being an initial step, everyone just knew we're not going to set goals until we have some data collected. Secondly, I think the probing questions that leaders ask, especially if we're getting into a territory where we're saying, wait a minute, are we thinking about this correctly? Could there be another explanation for this? We can ask those with empathy, right? Communicating that you're asking questions and gathering more information because you want to solve the right problem and make things better, not because you doubt the teacher's professional judgment or experience, is so important, right? And then the third one is make sure we're always considering those environmental factors and skill deficits that might be in play. Um, and in the case with Aiden, that environmental factor of like being around the secretary, let's dig into that a little bit more deeply, rather than running again with the assumption that always getting the attention that he needs is going to really help, I think, put a pause in our process.
Awesome. So we'd love to hear a little bit from you all, leaders in the room. When is it most difficult for you to avoid this pitfall, Teachers in the room, think of a time when your leader made you feel heard or and helped you dig deeper. What did they say? What did they do that was helpful? So we'll pause here. If you'd like to share, we'd love to hear a little bit about your experiences.
Earlier that someone's response was, not having time. And so I wonder if for leaders, again, that it has to, we're problem solving so quickly, right? And we're feeling a lot of pressure to get to a solution is going to
Yeah,
be just a common one that we see pop up again and again, right?
yeah,
Yeah. Being pulled in multiple directions. It might be helpful to hear a little bit more about what you mean by that because the other thing, yeah, time to invest the time and the energy. I think the other thing is, right, in those initial phases of this conversation, you might have data that suggests that could be just as suggestive of two functions, right? It could be easy to justify your hypothesis around, oh, the function of the behavior is attention, or it's work avoidance, or escape from difficult tasks, because maybe the student does have a lot of academic deficits. And so it's reasonable to assume that they're trying to escape difficult tasks. Um, and so again, it's not very satisfying to be like, oh, we have two really competing theories going on here and we need to gather more information. Sometimes the information is we've tried a bunch of interventions aligned to one and they're not showing progress. And so maybe it's time to shift our thinking and kind of completely abandon those interventions and try a new suite of things, because what we've been doing hasn't been working. But that can be really, really difficult to kind of say, like, we're going to stop everything over here and start a whole new set of things for this student. Let's move on to our second pitfall. Rachel, do you want to set this one up?
for sure. So, this pitfall is about the language we use to describe student behavior. And again, as you listen to the scenario, think about what's problematic about how the team is operating.
You ready to role play again, Rachel?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so we're here to discuss interventions for Miss Jalen today. Miss Burley, tell us what you're seeing.
Well, Jalen just has no motivation. She doesn't care about school. She doesn't care about homework. She doesn't care about anything, and she just refuses to try.
Has she always struggled with motivation like this?
From what I've seen, I think so. Her teacher last year described her as lazy and said she rarely completed homework. So I think this is just who she is.
I mean, I don't love the lazy, but what have you tried so far?
I don't know. I've tried talking to her about her goals in life. I've been trying to help her see that she needs to care more about her education. I think she's capable of doing the work because when I sit down with her and go through it, she catches on pretty quickly.
Okay. Well, if she can do it, but she's not doing it, right? Like that's a can do, won't do situation. I think we should try a reward system, right? Like give her some incentives, learn about what actually will motivate her. She'll become more motivated, right? So, do you want to talk to her again around like what would actually motivate her to do her work? Like what does she care about, even if it's tangible?
Yeah, I think she likes gummy bears, but I'll talk to her and see what we can put in
Okay.
place.
Who doesn't love gummy bears, right?
Sour.
Yeah. So once again, we've got a teacher with a hypothesis, right, of Jalen's behavior. I think she can do the work. She just doesn't want to. She's not motivated. She generally doesn't see the connection between doing well in school and doing well in life. I've talked to her about those things. I've checked in with her former teachers to see if they had any ideas. And ultimately, we decide to use a reward system to motivate her, which I think, again, is a very common way that schools approach behavior when the assumption is that students aren't very motivated, but are capable of the skill. So, what I noticed immediately was that we were all operating from some very vague, subjective judgments about Jalen and her behavior, right? We weren't describing anything that we could measure or observe objectively.
You're right. Yeah. So the teacher and the leader in this scenario keep describing the problem here as Jalen's laziness or her lack of motivation to do well in school. So we hear these kinds of vague descriptions often, words like disruptive, rude, lazy.
Yeah. What happens when we do this, right? I think there's a lot of consequences from operating off of vague descriptions of behavior. Some are more technical and some are more adaptive and have to do with the way we feel in this process. For starters, we're hindering our ability to collect and use data that we just talked about. The power of data to kind of help us see that there might be a different function of the behavior, right? It makes it difficult for everyone on Jalen's team to also be talking about the same problem. So it's impacting our communication among team members. What is defiance or disrespect or laziness to you might be different for me as another teacher or part of her team. And so maybe I'm experiencing an improvement over time. Maybe the disrespect that we've all seen is getting better for me, but it's getting worse for you. But that's because we're describing two very different sets of behavior from the start. So we can't collect reliable data. We're not talking about the same behavior in an objective, observable way. And we missed that opportunity to create a real function based understanding of the behavior. We're not getting to why because we've already assigned a why. We've already said, well, the reason she acts this way is because insert vague description that might be actually a harmful judgment about her personality or what she does and doesn't care about. Um, Maybe what her family does and doesn't care about, right? So they don't allow us to get to the root cause of behavior and create a function-based intervention, which we know are more effective, right? We have data, we have research that tells us that those are going to be the types of interventions that move the needle for kids.
Krista, why do you think this is such a common pitfall? I have some ideas, but want to know what you think.
Well, I honestly, I think when we start to hear that vague language about kids, I think it's one of our first signs of adult stress, right? When you're overwhelmed, when you're frustrated with a kid, we lose energy for the nuance and the specificity. Like we just want the problem to stop. Secondly, I think most often the idea, I'll go back a slide, right? This idea of like operationally defining a behavior, or even calling it a target behavior, right? Talking about things that are observable, measurable, gathering data. Those are steps that are often left for a behavior specialist or a school psychologist when they're doing like a really formal functional behavior assessment or an evaluation. So, but by that point, months have gone by without the student receiving an effective intervention because we didn't have like a working hypothesis to go off of. So we were trying a bunch of things, and then we get the specialist in because it's been 8 months of trying this point sheet and nothing's getting better. But we could have been further down the road of having a working set of responses, interventions, plans if we had just gotten more specific and more targeted and less vague earlier. So I
Yeah.
think that's what's behind it is we're frustrated. We've been trying a lot and nothing's working, and so we kind of just keep doing the same thing.
Yeah. So when we think about what leaders should do instead, the first thing we name is to train staff and use protocols to operationally define behavior. So being sure that your team is speaking from shared language that you all have normed on. We also want to create and reinforce meeting norms that support curiosity and specificity, not making quick judgments or decisions about the behavior in question. And so, a lot of times, us as leaders can model that for teachers and also ask some clarifying questions when you do hear that vague language.
Yeah, I think these are all great pushes, right? The goal is for someone in that meeting and in that space to help the team move from vagueness or judgment to precision, right? From this student is lazy, or this student is disrespectful to tell me what disrespect looks like, right? What do you mean that she's lazy? What are the things that she's having trouble completing so that we can start to really understand some patterns here? We're going to make data collection more objective and reliable. We're going to have better communication among the team members if we all start off on the same page. We're also going to actually be able to understand the why, which is really important. Earlier that we have a working hypothesis, the sooner we can collect data and see if that is actually what's going to work. All right, our third and final pitfall. Rachel, take us through this one.
Awesome. So, this pitfall is about where we focus our energy in problem-solving conversations. So, we're going to look at a scenario about a student named Deshaun.
So Deshaun has been in three fights this semester, and we need a plan. So tell me what you think's going on.
Honestly, as a teacher, I know there's a lot going on with his mom and dad at home, and he's coming to school angry these days. I'm not even sure we can make a plan for him.
Yeah, has anyone reached out to grandma?
I tried calling, but she works two jobs. She's never available. It's tough to get the family involved. It always has been.
Well, I mean, we can't change what's going on at home. I mean, we can be understanding. I know the social worker's involved, but I mean, at this point, after three fights, I feel like all we can do is we need to document. And if it happens again, we keep moving up the consequence ladder to prove that we're taking this seriously, right? To show the family like this is very serious and we need your involvement in here. Um, I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I just don't think he's gonna stop getting into fights, but what can we really do? He's making this choice.
Yeah. So this conversation really focused on the relationship between Deshaun's behavior and his home life. And you can tell that the team's feeling pretty convinced that there's nothing that they can do about the fighting. So what's the pitfall or the trap here, right? I like to call this one just ignoring prevention. With this one, what we see most often is folks spending a lot of time discussing plans that simply outline how we're going to react once a behavior happens, either because we're pretty convinced that there's not much we can do to prevent it, or because we feel this need to like show that we're taking it seriously, right? So very little time is spent analyzing data for patterns, putting proactive strategies in place or adjusting parts of the environment that could reduce the likelihood of something happening again.
Yeah. So in this case with Deshaun, the team's plan is entirely reactive. Wait, document, and punish after the behavior happens again. No one brought up adjusting the environment. Could they assign an adult to check in with Deshaun during his tricky transitions? Could they give him an alternative route to avoid peers that he may have problem with? Could they teach him to recognize when he's escalated and give him a place to go? All of these are interventions that the team didn't get a chance to discuss or consider.
Yeah. I think the consequences of this are really so tangible, right? We see this exhausting cycle where the behavior continues, we respond with a consequence, it happens again, we double down, or we have a bigger consequence, but we've never interrupted that cycle with any preventative strategies. We've also never taught the student a skill that they might be missing. And in general, we just underestimate how powerful those environmental modifications and proactive skill building can be, right? We start to think, especially with older students, right? This student should already know not to fight rather
Right.
than what skill is missing here that we need to teach, or what are the factors in the environment that are making it so likely for this student in particular to be getting in so many fights.
Yeah, and I think most of us have seen this happen as well, especially when we're stuck in this cycle. Relationships end up getting damaged. The path to repairing those becomes more tricky and difficult as time goes on.
Yeah, for sure. I think can be hard to show a student that you care about them when there are things that we could do to make that behavior not happen because the doesn't want to be engaging in that behavior. It doesn't feel like great to be in trouble, to be fighting in school. I don't think kids prefer that, right? But it can be hard to repair those relationships when it's clear from the student's perspective that the adults around you don't think that there's like any chance of things changing. I think kids can really pick up on that and sense it too.
Yeah.
I think we've talked a little bit about why it's so common, but um, Rachel, do you want to share what you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple reasons. The first is that identifying patterns and making plans for prevention takes time to put in place. So we talked about that time piece, the capacity piece. It takes a lot of time to get these things right. So if we're feeling urgency to act, we might default to something familiar, like a consequence. Additionally, I think we underestimate how powerful environmental modifications and proactive skill building can be. We're used to thinking, well, the student should already know not to fight, or you
Yeah.
know, they should have learned that already, but we also have to think through what skill is missing here that we might need to teach them.
Yeah. I think thinking about what we could change about the environment or what skills we might need to teach a student requires like so much more discussion and planning than we usually dedicate in these conversations. And so the fact that time is always a factor is definitely there. And the attitudes around the way that students learn what's right and wrong is through consequence and punishment. And so if he doesn't know it now, right, what are we going to do when he exhibits the behavior again that's going to send that message more clearly? I see this becoming a thing that is really hard to break out of with older students, and especially around behaviors like fighting, which I think is why we use that as a sort of the example here. Very common.
Yeah.
So what should we do instead?
Yeah, so I think one of the main things for me is as leaders, we have to shift our perspective from planning our response when the behavior occurs to thinking through how can we actively prevent the behavior. And when we do that, we can see the focus on that skill building and making sure that students understand what they need to be successful and have fewer incidents.
Yeah. I think once again we come back to the power of data, right? If leaders are doing this well, they're using data to identify patterns and high risk situations. In a situation with Deshaun, he's now had 3 fights, which means we have some incident data that we should be digging into. When is it happening? What time of day? With whom? Is it the same 3 people? Is it in the same 3 times of day, same transition, same part of the school, right? There are ways to use data to answer questions like how could we prevent this from happening? Or maybe what might be a way that could reduce the likelihood that this will happen again. When we use those insights to sort of modify some things, we're probably going to see some success, especially if we have a lot of data to work from. Like fight incident data, there's 3. But if we're talking about something that happens daily with a student, again, collecting that data, we're going to have more insights into patterns that we can learn from and adjust from there. Um, I think thinking about how we can also make sure that we are teaching skills before the next incident occurs. I know that we always think that this is a teachable moment, right? With the student, like, okay, he had a fight, he's calming down in the office, we're going to have a big talk with him. Maybe it'll be tomorrow when he returns from school or after his suspension, right? But doing this before the next time it happens is so key. So, who's in charge of pulling the student? Who's in charge of figuring out what skill building needs to happen? Is it an individual type of learning that needs, could this happen in a group? Is something that I think gets missed a lot. We have these sort of teaching conversations when a kid is escalated, or maybe they're already feeling pretty bad about an incident that happened. That's not when kids are most primed to learn, right? We have to do this in a scheduled, proactive way before the next time a fight happens with this student.
Yeah. So, overall, one of the themes here is about what questions leaders are asking. So, we've compiled a list of some of the most powerful questions leaders can ask in these problem-solving spaces. So, on the left, you'll see questions about the behavior, and then on the right, about adult well-being. So, these can really shift teams toward kind of using those best practices.
Yeah. And like you said, the ones on the left are really about helping teams move past their surface level understanding of a behavior, right? Avoiding vague language, focusing on prevention. These are all sort of technical shifts that help us do a different set of work, be more data driven. But the questions on the right are also the ones that leaders need to ask to help support the adults that are doing those shifts and support that adult well being. Things like, how are you doing with all of this? What support do you need? Especially once we've made a plan, right? What's going to make this plan feel manageable for you? How can we deploy our school's resources to support you and the student, especially in a situation with a student who needs that skill development? That probably can't happen through that student's classroom teacher. They're teaching them a lot of other things during the day. They might not be able to be the person that does a small group lesson on recognizing when you're being escalated or building more positive peer relationships so that you're not fighting. So really thinking about the mix of the two types of questions that we're asking and tending to the adult well-being in the room is super important. I want to share a resource with you that we've developed. One way that we think about normalizing some of these practices is to just use a protocol that is well known and we use it repetitively. It becomes sort of the way that we talk about challenging behavior. So it doesn't feel like pushback to ask questions, and it doesn't feel like you're pausing the process to gather more information because that's just what our protocol calls for, right? So whether you're in an MTSS meeting, so it's formalized conversation, whether this is a more informal discussion with a teacher, maybe this is in preparing for an upcoming behavior or an IP meeting where behavior is going to be discussed, right? These are the types of standard sets of questions that can keep that team on track to make sure they're talking about the right things. We think this planning tool is something that folks can use right away in maybe your next discussion about behavior. Maybe if you already have a protocol in place, you can do a crosswalk with this and see, do we have any gaps in how we plan these conversations? So we're going to drop this link in the chat. We'd love for you to try it out. Let us know if you do try it, if it's helpful. If you're someone, again, who has an existing tool that you're using, and you want some support to maybe adjust it in any way, reach out to us. Let us know how we can be supportive of that process. Bottom line, headlines from today's discussion. I think in just chatting through those examples with you, Rachel, the one thing that's standing out to me is that this problem solving process is one that has to be a little demystified for folks. It needs to be formalized because a leader, right, asking the questions that they ask, the language that they model, the focus that they help the team maintain, those are the ones that are really going to shape the outcomes for kids. If we use the right best practices, we're going to get better interventions, which means kids are going to make progress towards their goals. And that's going to interrupt that really like that self-defeating cycle when these pitfalls do come up. So we're caring for teachers' well-being and also getting better outcomes at the same time.
Yeah, I totally agree. And when we do give our teams the tools to understand behavior better and respond more effectively, that actually improves everyone's well-being. So when adults are well, then they have the capacity to engage in better practices, and that's what we want in schools.
Yeah. And when things are going well, adults are better, right? It's like this cycle that keeps feeding itself. It's like, well, we're getting better outcomes with kids, so we're all feeling better about it. But also, while we're on the path to that, the adults have to be feeling supported enough,
Yeah.
right? To keep going because this does take time and is a process. So are folks prepared for that? It can be a long haul to try a couple of things and then have to pivot and adjust our hypothesis. So are folks feeling supported in that journey? They can only really weather that when they do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what you can expect from us when it comes to this topic. So you can expect some emails in the new year. We're going to be planning to share a few new resources with you all, kind of putting some of the things that we've shared together into more of a toolkit. We have some limited spots for some consultations. I know at this point of the year, I think this is where most folks are getting to a sort of a tipping point of like, we have tried a process with a certain number of students. We're not seeing the results. What could we be doing differently? Where are we maybe not getting the hypothesis right? So if that sounds like it would be helpful for you, we're going to be sharing some ways that you can take advantage of those opportunities. And we also are going to have some exclusive discounts for this type of training, for functions of behavior training, for staff, or for leaders. And so if you've attended a webinar, if you've registered for one, you will be getting some of those offers in your inbox very soon. Additionally, launching in January, we're going to take it on a new topic. We're going to be talking about specially designed instruction. These two things are related. And we think it's a topic that folks really do want to dive into and talk about. So we will be launching that series in the new year. In the meantime, we want to say thank you so much for being here today and for engaging so thoughtfully. Take a moment and complete our survey. We're going to put the link, there's a QR code on the screen, but we'll also put the link in the chat. Give us feedback about what you liked, what was helpful to hear. If you have any questions or thoughts, we can also share those in the chat as we close out. Um, as you're taking the survey, just a quick reminder, there's a question about, are you taking this? When are you taking this? And please choose the one that says I'm completing this after a training or workshop. But we'll stick around for a few more minutes if folks have questions. If there's anything you'd like to share in the chat, we will be here. And we really appreciate your engagement today. I know this topic is on everyone's mind. Thank you, Jackie. Um, Hope it has given you some helpful language or ideas to kind of help push you along in this process.